My name's Amy Tate. I'm the Principal Policy Officer for the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Western Australia. Welcome to our webinar on making complaints systems child-friendly. We're still waiting for people to join us, so I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping while we're waiting. The first is that if you're experiencing bad sound at any time, feel free to call through the telephone. That'll give you a better landline. And the number you can ring is 6311 8988, 6311 8988, or 1800 896 323. Also, just over on the right-hand side of your panel there's a place where you can write out comments or questions. We're asking that you write out questions as you think of them, and then at the end of the sessions we'll respond to your questions. And if you could direct your questions to everyone, you have a choice of everyone or the moderator. If you could direct them to everyone, that would be really useful for us. Thank you. Okay. The presenter today is myself, Amy Tate from CCYP, and we also have a representative from the Ombudsman. It's not Mary White, it's Lauren Howe. She'll be presenting. We've got some issues with sound, I think, from some participants. Jill Pierce is saying it's dropping it out sometimes. Perhaps, Jill, you could call the telephone line that I mentioned. The number is 6311 8988. That should solve the sound problem. I'll write in that telephone number here. So the rundown of the morning, it's an hour-long webinar, and this is what it will comprise. First of all, me, for the first half an hour, I'll just give a bit of a rundown of the role of the Commissioner, and then talk about the complaints guidelines that we produced, and what we learned through that process, and the advice that the kids themselves gave us. And then at about 10:30, Lauren from the Ombudsman will step in the seat to talk about the role of the Ombudsman, and also how to make complaints processes as robust and child-friendly as possible. Just before I start as well, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation from Noongar land, and I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional owners, both past and present. So I just want to begin by giving a bit of an overview of the Commissioner for Children and Young People. Our Commissioner, that's good, Jill can hear us. Our Commissioner, Michelle Scott, was the inaugural Western Australian Commissioner, and she was appointed under the Act, under the Commissioner for Children and Young People Act in 2006. She was appointed in December 2007. She, basically, her role is one of broad advocacy. She's required to represent the needs of all Western Australian children and young people under 18. The legislation also requires that she gives priority and special regard to Aboriginal children and young people, as well as to children and young people who are vulnerable or disadvantaged for any reason. So she's independent of government, reports directly to Parliament, and has a number of functions, including to monitor and review draft and written laws, policies, practices, and services affecting children and young people. The legislation steps out some of her functions in relation to complaints handling as well. One function is to monitor the way in which a government agency investigates or deals with a complaint made by a child or young person and the outcome of that complaint. Section 19E talks about her responsibility to monitor the trends in complaints made by children and young people to government agencies. But the Act then goes on to stipulate that the Commissioner isn't to investigate or deal with complaints made by individual children or young people. So it's very clear that she's not a complaints handling body per se for individual complaints, but she does have a systemic role in monitoring trends and complaint systems. Just further to that, there's another part of the legislation that sets out the Commissioner's responsibility to promote the participation of children and young people in the decision-making processes that affect their lives. So that dovetails quite nicely with the complaints function insofar as if a complaint system is built with consultation by children and young people, then they obviously have participated in that process, but also that more broadly they're then able to participate in the functions of an agency and society more generally. So now I'll just go on to talk about the complaints guidelines that were produced by the Commissioner. They're these ones. Are you listening? It's a guidelines for making complaints processes accessible and responsive to children and young people. I'll talk a bit about why it's important, what we learnt in the development of the guidelines, and then how to put it into practice in your own agency. In 2008, when the Commissioner was establishing her office, obviously one of the things that needed to be built into the new office was a complaint system. The Commissioner wanted it to be as child-friendly as possible and really to reflect best practice in the area. So we started by doing some desktop research and looking at what other agencies had done, and we found that there wasn't actually a great deal out there. There was some work going on in the eastern states and some going on internationally, but generally it wasn't an area that many people had touched on. When the Commissioner went to agencies to find out what systems they had built in, one of the very frequent comments that she got was that children and young people don't complain, but we interpreted that to mean really that children and young people probably have as much to complain about the rest of us, and if they're not complaining, it's because they're meeting some sort of barrier at some stage, and it's incumbent on agencies, therefore, to make their systems more accessible to children and young people. Secondly, it's important simply because children and young people are citizens. Just like the rest of us, they have a right to be heard if an agency is affecting their life, impacting it in some way. And agencies do play significant roles in children and young people's lives. Education, health, transport, you name it, they're impacted by many government and non-government agencies. Another reason that it's important to develop particular systems that are unique to children and young people is because they do face unique barriers and a power imbalance that many adults perhaps wouldn't face if they wanted to lodge a complaint. The first of which, and this came up repeatedly in our consultation with children and young people, but it's also come up time and time again in subsequent research all over the world, is their particular and deeply held fear of not being taken seriously. It's hard to impress this point enough. Children and young people really don't think that if they lodge a complaint, any adult will take them seriously. And so if they do manage to lodge a complaint, it's obviously extremely important that they are taken seriously, because overcoming that fear has been significant for them. Fear of intimidation is another thing, or just being intimidated generally by the whole process, and an uncertainty of the process and any bureaucracy that they might face along the way. They also have concerns about exposure and about victimisation. They don't know that if they lodge a complaint about their teacher, whether their teacher's going to be the first person to find out or not, and whether the situation's just going to get worse, for example. So there's some of the unique barriers that children might face in lodging a complaint. Concerns that I mentioned about not being taken seriously are sometimes well-founded. There's been several inquiries across the country now that have shown that departments sometimes have a disbelieving attitude towards complainants, or they place greater weight on employee welfare than on complainants' needs. Just as a point of interest, the English Commissioner for Children has recently reported on complaint systems in mental health and sexual health services, and found that barriers to children and young people making a complaint include that complaint systems are too complicated, they take too long, they rely too much on written skills, and they're overly formal. Some complaint systems in Western Australia will only accept complaints if they're received in writing, which is obviously a barrier to many children and young people. Others might only accept a complaint from a child if parental consent is given, which again could prove difficult for children who don't have access to their parents. Staff, the Commissioner for Children in England found that staff were not trained to receive and act on complaints made by children and young people, and that staff often regarded complaints as negative rather than something to learn from. They also found that complaints were not always treated in confidence, and sometimes young people and children were labelled as troublemakers straight off the bat. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of those findings would be applicable to some agencies in Western Australia, and certainly something to be mindful of when developing your system. But because of all those barriers and fears, it really is necessary to go that extra mile to make the system more child-friendly so that children and young people feel welcomed, feel comfortable and feel safe in lodging a complaint. I'll just talk a bit now about the consultation exercise that we ran with children and young people. We did this because we had found that, like I said, there was a bit of lack of information about what would make a best practice child-friendly complaint system. So we decided to ask the children and young people themselves. So the Commissioner organised a consultation with about 30 children and young people. It was a theatre-based consultation, so the kids got to act out their idea of what making a complaint would look like or should look like. And these are just some of our findings on this slide here. First of all, that they absolutely understood the concept of making a complaint. They knew that if something had gone wrong, that a complaint was a way of redressing that situation and finding a remedy. Secondly, there it is again, the big point that they were wary about not being taken seriously. It came up time and time again when the children and young people were acting out their scenes. Whoever played the adult was invariably dismissive of the child lodging a complaint, or didn't listen to them, or didn't address the issue at all. So it came up regularly. Children and young people, all of them generally said that they would prefer to change their behaviour or circumstances rather than lodge a complaint. They would just remove themselves. So you can see from that comment that a complaint was seen by the children and young people really as a last resort, something that to be avoided at all costs. We asked them at the beginning to name a government department to see their understanding of the bureaucracy, and they said Parliament House and the Prime Minister. So they couldn't actually name a government department. They didn't understand that there were agencies in charge of things like buses and schools. So there's a long way to go to educate children and young people on where they can go if they have a problem. They would also, all of them would prefer to have an advocate complain on their behalf rather than lodge a complaint and go through the process themselves. Some of the children and young people said that they would prefer to talk through an issue. They felt that face-to-face resolution was really their preference. Others were very non-confrontational and would much rather write an email or a letter than that. So that indicates as well the need for flexibility in any complaint system for children and young people. They wanted very quick access, and they wanted it to be as welcoming as possible. One girl said that she thought every agency should have a banner across the top of their door saying, "You are welcome to come and talk to us." Now, while I know that's not necessarily practical, there are ways you can make your system as inviting as possible so children and young people don't feel intimidated right at the outset of the process. They all said that they would first of all seek advice from friends, parents and teachers. They were the three that were listed primarily by this group of children and young people. And I'll just say at this stage we do understand the research limitations of the exercise we ran. It was only with 30 children, and they weren't a particularly diverse group of children and young people. There were definitely vulnerable and disadvantaged children that were not represented in this group. So I'm sure there'd be other advocates that other children would look to advice from. But if you just take that example of friends, parents and teachers, it demonstrates the need to educate the people around children and young people about where they can go if they need help, because the children will be asking them. And finally, of course, they wanted to be listened to and respected, which is obviously no different than the rest of us. But it links back to the taking them seriously point, that once they have overcome the hurdle in order to make a complaint, then they do need to be respected and listened to appropriately. So this slide just shows some of the guiding principles for best practice child-centred complaint systems. We've taken these from a report done by British Columbia Representative for Children, but they are consistent with what we found in our work and with other reports on child-friendly complaints. The first is obviously a focus on best interests of the child, so that they are at the centre of the complaints system. That the system acknowledges the right for children and young people to be heard and to be taken seriously, and that support and advocacy mechanisms are also provided within that system. It's important at this point probably to acknowledge the spectrum of complaints that you could be talking about here. On the one hand, you could have a fairly logistical complaint about, for example, a train running late, a service not being provided. But on the other end of the spectrum, you also may be dealing with allegations of mistreatment or allegations of abuse. So complaint systems that are child-friendly and built appropriately should be able to deal with that full spectrum accordingly and in a respectful way. So that spectrum really does cover complaints, but also concerns and feedback from children and young people, and invites all of those elements. Particularly vulnerable children or children at risk, for example, those who don't have access to their parents, don't have support from their parents, or are living away from home, they will need additional assistance. And that's particularly where this provision of support and advocacy comes in, that a system must build that in order that the children can feel supported enough to be able to lodge their complaint. Other guiding principles is a respect for cultural and other differences, to ensure that children and young people are aware of the mechanisms and that there is accessibility for children with differing needs, capabilities, and also that the system is fair, transparent and timely. So there's a lot of factors to keep in mind, and when we were building our own system here at the Commissioner's Office, we broke that down really into two separate functions. First of all, that the system must be accessible, and secondly, that the system must be responsive to children and young people. So if you think about accessibility as the front end of the system, this is where the complaints are clearly invited. This is where you've provided a number of methods for them to lodge complaint, especially face-to-face for those ones who want to talk through an issue or who want to be there supported by an advocate. And the process for lodging a complaint must be simple. Obviously, if the children and young people have to complete a written form in triplicate, there's probably not a great likelihood that they will be completing that process. Other points about making the system accessible, the children explained to us that they would like the process clearly explained, just with diagrams. They said to us not to go overboard with information. They just wanted a few facts on a postcard, to quote one little girl. So again, that's important to make sure that the publications are age appropriate, that they're written in child-friendly language. Once again, there the advocates are supported is another important element of making sure a system's accessible, as is taking the process out to children and young people. So not relying on them finding your system or having to come to you, but that you send people out to build relationships with children and young people. Again, that's particularly important for the vulnerable and disadvantaged kids who might need extra support, that your system goes to them and encourages their feedback along the way. You get to the responsive part of a system. So this is the back end. Once a child or a young person has taken the massive step and overcome all of those barriers we spoke about in order to make a complaint, it's really important that the back end of the system then deals with the child or the young person appropriately, respectfully and quickly, so that they feel like they're being taken seriously, and well, so they are being taken seriously. This includes building in a very quick response. Children and young people have different time frames and different expectations to adults. They told us they would like a response within 24 hours, wherever possible. Telephone complaints, being on hold, was a surefire way to lose them from the system. So they wanted an immediate response to that. And that recipients who deal with the complaints made by children and young people are trained and respectful is another important element. The recipient needs to understand what the child and young person has gone through, what they've overcome, just in order to be dealing with the complaint system in an agency. They need to understand how significant that is for them and take it from there. Building a safe place within an agency for face-to-face complaints was another comment made by children and young people, as was the importance of limiting the number of people that they dealt with. No more than 2 at any stage in the process really was desired. Some children and young people told us they would like regular updates on progress, but others told us that they didn't really want to know what was happening until the end, until it had been resolved. So we thought then that it was probably best that the child decide how to be kept informed of progress, that they get asked at the beginning how often and whether they would like to know about what's going on with their complaints. So I've just got a few examples and resources from nationally and internationally of where the child-friendly elements have been put into practice. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. This is a web snapshot from the Irish Ombudsman for Children. Ireland have a specific ombudsman who receive complaints and can investigate complaints made by children and young people or by someone on behalf of children and young people. So this website just, it does have quite a lot of elements of best practice. Down the bottom there's a video that tells a story of a child who made a complaint to the Ombudsman and the process that happened as a consequence. They've got lots of publications over here on the right about that are written in child-friendly language. Here's just an example of one of their brochures. So this is how to make a complaint. If you take what I was looking at earlier, this is about building in the accessibility of the system. They've just got a simple, easy 1, 2, 3 step. And over there on the left-hand side is a quote from the Ombudsman telling them that they will be taken seriously. So they've obviously picked up on that message, that they need to assure children and young people that if they go to that agency, they will be listened to. And then this is another brochure from the Irish Ombudsman. So this is about the responsiveness. This explains to children and young people what happens when they do receive a complaint, explains the back end of the system a bit more. This is from our office. Our Commissioner for Children and Young People produced this flowchart which explains to children what will happen when they lodge a complaint. So fairly straightforward. And then at the end, they've got the option to know what's going on, and they've got the option to just hear from us at the end of the complaints process. This is a flowchart that was produced by Create, the Agency for Children and Young People in Care. Create heard from the kids in care that they didn't really know who to go to if they had a complaint or a concern, and that they felt that the whole process was very confusing. So Create produced this flowchart for kids in care that really reassures them that if they do have a complaint, they can do something about it, and it outlines the steps they need to take along the way. This is a snapshot from the New South Wales Ombudsman, who has a page, several pages on their website dedicated to young people. So you can see it's very straightforward information, the way they've laid it out, and very clear for young people about the process. The New South Wales Ombudsman also produced these guidelines for dealing with youth complaints, which I would encourage you to take a look at. They're very good insofar as explaining the best ways to communicate with children and young people once they have lodged a complaint, and some of the expectations that need to be managed along the way. And this is a report from the British Columbian Representative for Children and Youth. They did a study about child-centred approach to complaint resolution. I've just got that there as an example to read for further information about this topic. And that's all from me for the first half of the morning. We haven't got any questions along the way. Are there any questions now? Just a few minutes in case anyone wants to write something. Do you have a question? Just type it in the box. Would address it to everyone. It doesn't look like we do, so at this stage I will hand over to Lauren Howe from the Ombudsman, who's going to talk about making complaint systems robust and child-friendly, and give a bit of an overview of the role of the Ombudsman.
Okay. Good morning. I think just before I get into the presentation, I'll just give a bit of an overview about our office and what we do. The current Ombudsman is Chris Fields, and he's and WA was the first state in Australia to establish the Office of the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman was created as an independent officer of the Parliament, and has a responsibility to investigate the administrative laws of the Parliament. So I'll just give you a quick overview as to what our principal functions are. The primary function that I think most people are probably aware of is that we investigate complaints. So that's receiving, investigating and resolving complaints about the administrative decision-making and practices of public sector, local government and universities as well. We also review certain child deaths and also domestic violence fatalities. And another function is own motion investigations and administrative improvements. And we also have other functions which include telecommunication oversight, and we're also the Energy Ombudsman. Just to give you an idea about our complaint resolution role, actually, so once we receive a complaint, sometimes we may find that there's actions that we may need to put in place to improve public administration. And so those sort of things can include improving systems to correct problems, change or improve policies and practices, improve record keeping, and things like providing or suggesting that agencies provide informal training for staff. We also may find, once we have resolved a complaint, that there are some actions that we may suggest or recommend that will assist the complainant. And so these can include things like providing an explanation or a reason for the decision, expediting an action, withdrawing or reduction of a criminal or disciplinary change or infringement, and also sometimes it's just simply providing an apology. Get into the presentation now. Okay, just a brief overview of what the presentation will be about. So just briefly an introduction, and then the 10 best practice complaint handling principles, and how these principles can be used in making complaint handling systems more accessible to children and young people. Okay, our office has a strong interest in ensuring complaint handling by organisations is fair and effective. So what we often do is when we do receive a complaint, if it hasn't been taken to the agency in the first place, we will ask the complainant to do that in the first instance. And since February 2010, the Public Sector Commissioner's Complaint Management Circular has had a link to our website. So on the website there's a number of guidelines and publications that can assist agencies in their complaint handling role. The guidelines on complaint handling are available on our website, and I believe the details will be at the end of this presentation. And these are based on 10 good practice principles for effective complaint handling that are consistent with the Australian standard of complaint handling. Okay, so the 10 best practice complaint handling principles can fit into three subheadings. So those subheadings are enabling complaints, responding to complainants, and accountability and learning. When developing a complaint handling system and applying the principles, it's important for the agency or the organisation to consider the system is fit for purpose. So the agency or organisation may wish to look at whether the complaint handling system is proportionate to the number and types of complaints it's receiving. Complaint systems for children and young people should be visible and accessible and empower them to make complaints be sensitive, tailored, appropriate and responsive to their needs. Okay, the first practice principle is customer focus. So your organisation is committed to effective complaint handling and values feedback through complaints. So the organisation may wish to look at what proportion of customers are children and young people. So our office did a survey in 2009-10, and a third of agencies didn't actually know what percentage of their customers were children and young people. Visibility is another key principle, and it's make sure that information about how and where to complain is well publicised to customers, staff and other interested parties. So for children and young people, consider making information about your organisation's services and how to complain by providing this feedback perhaps online or in locations that are regularly visited by young people. So that may be schools or TAFEs, universities, things like that. You also need to think about making the complaint system accessible. So the process for making a complaint and investigating it is easy for the complainants to access and understand. For children and young people, this information about complaints should be simple and clear. Complaints should be accepted in a number of different ways, including in person, over the phone, in writing, email, fax, letters, and also consider things like SMS and new media fronts, which are being used by children more often. Use experienced staff where possible who can adapt their communication skills when corresponding with children and young people, and also accepting complaints on behalf of children from people like their parents, guardians or advocates. Responsiveness, so complaints are acknowledged promptly and addressed according to urgency, and the complainant is kept informed throughout the process. And for children and young people, it could mean that providing acknowledgement of receipt of their complaint once it's received, informing them of the anticipated time it will take to resolve their complaint, and communicating with them regularly about the progress. Though, as Amy mentioned before, it may be something that you need to discuss with each individual complainant, as they may have different requests as to how often they're updated. Objectivity and fairness. So complainants are dealt with in an equitable, objective and unbiased manner. So this will ensure that the complaint handling process is fair and reasonable. When dealing with young people and children, ensure that they are aware of the nature and limitations of your organisation's services from the beginning, and including what does it mean to be objective, and discuss options that if they wish to require an advocate or a support person when lodging a complaint. Confidentiality is also very important. Personal information related to the complainant is kept confidential. The organisation, when dealing with children and young people, may need to consider, for example, will parents be able to inquire on their child's behalf as to the progress of a complaint, or finding out information about that. remedy, so if a complaint is upheld, the organisation provides a remedy. So you may want to, again, discuss with the children or young person their expectations early on to ensure that it's reasonable and achievable. And having an experienced and trained officer explain the reasons behind the redress decisions. So, for example, if it also does not go as expected or they don't achieve something that they wish to, explaining to them in a way that they understand as to why that didn't occur. Review. There are opportunities for internal and external or appeal about the organisation's response to the complainant, and complaints are informed of these avenues. So this could mean informing them verbally of the review process that is available and how these can be accessed. Accountability for complainants is also important, so handling their complaints is clearly established with them, and that the responses to them are monitored and reported to the management and other stakeholders. So consider monitoring and reporting on complaints from children and young people to allow identification of specific issues or trends that may be affecting children and young people within the organisation. And continuous improvement. So complaints are considered a source of improvement for organisations. Complaints are a source of innovation and developing and improving an organisation's business processes. Analysis of complaints can reveal systemic improvements in improving operations at the organisational level. Consider analysing complaints from children and young people and making improvements to benefit children and young people as a group. Continuous improvement can also be applied at your complaint handling system as a whole, and consider whether appropriate surveying children and young people about their experience of your complaint system. So these are our contact details, and as I mentioned before, you can access some of the publications and brochures and things like that about complaint handling on our website. Just leave it if there's any questions that want to come through.
Thanks for that. No questions for Lauren? Okay. I'll just continue. Just take this opportunity to run through a bit of a case study of an agency that has started to do some really good work in terms of making their complaints processes accessible and responsive to children and young people. And this is... here we go. It's the Department of Corrective Services. They did a bit of an audit of the complaints that they were receiving from the juvenile detention centres in Western Australia, and found that they were receiving very few complaints. I think it was 4 or something per year. And instead of assuming that this was because children and young people were very satisfied with the service, they believed that it was because they weren't making their complaint system accessible enough. So they've done a big review of what young offenders in custody might need to be able to be supported in that complaints making process. So they've set up Access, which is the Administration of Complaints, Compliments and Suggestions branch within the department. And this Access area also accepts complaints from the adult prisons, but is currently focusing quite a lot on how they can improve systems in this new Banksia Hill Detention Centre, which is going to be, which is currently opening and has amalgamated children and young people who are on remand and who are being held in custody, who are sentenced young people, and also the boys and the girls. They'll all be in Banksia Hill Detention Centre as of this month. So Access will be focusing on establishing an effective complaints mechanisms for young offenders who are in detention, but also those who are in the community. And a couple of the ways that they're going to do this is to establish telephone systems in the centres that have a one-dial button that gets them access to the access system. Phone calls will be free. They won't be recorded, so children and young people don't have to have any concerns about or confidentiality. They are also able to use telephone to make any number of calls they want to other oversight agencies such as the Inspector of Custodial Services, the Health and Disability Services Complaints Office, and of course the Ombudsman. They do accept verbal complaints. Complaints don't have to be written, which is particularly important for kids in the justice system who often have low literacy and numeracy levels. And parents and guardians, so the advocates also have access to this complaint service. The other element that they're putting into place, which is very in keeping with child-friendly systems, is that they're going to start making site visits to detention centres. So they'll be building relationships with the young people as well as letting them know about their system and inviting complaints. They're going to be encouraged to make face-to-face complaints when those site visits take place. And also they're going to work with the Toil group, who are the team of young leaders. So they're young offenders who have reached a level of seniority in the detention centre and lead the other kids. Inspiring. One system that they have put in place as well is this sort of double mailbox here. So they encourage children and young people to write letters to their family and friends, but also to lodge complaints to oversight agencies if they need to. One of those boxes is cleared regularly by General Post, and the other is for confidential mail. So they're put in particular envelopes, they're posted in those boxes, and they're cleared by administration staff, not open and sent directly to agencies such as the Ombudsman. So the child can be assured that their complaint will be kept confidential along that whole process. They're also considering establishing some kiosk sites to help children and young people make complaints online, and they will be put into the classrooms within the detention centre. Online complaints are obviously becoming increasingly important for children and young people, as are things like SMS complaints. The Department for Child Protection now accepts complaints from SMS. So those other media that Lauren talked about before are particularly important. They'll be encouraging accessibility and visibility of their systems through a number of merchandise, so to speak, basketball hats, T-shirts, footballs, all with the access information and contact details on there. And they're going to be running a competition on the design of posters so that children and young people themselves are directly involved, which is another significant point, that every agency has got different children and young people as clients. So one of the best ways to figure out how your system can be made child-friendly is by consulting directly with them, by running competitions like this, consultation exercises, and asking them what they want. Our experience would indicate that they have some very strong ideas about what makes a good system. So Access are very clear that the beneficiaries of their service will be the offenders themselves, but also more broadly the community and family members and the staff of the office. Looks like I've just been disconnected.
I'm back.
I'm back again. Is anybody else back?
Okay.
Okay. Is everybody still there? Yep. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Linda. Glad you're there. That I don't know what happened there. We just got cut off. Sorry about that. It was inevitable we were going to experience some sort of technical glitch along the way. Anyway, that is the conclusion of our webinar today. I'll just go back to the slide here that talks about our contact details, and also let you know that the guidelines that I spoke about earlier are available on the CCYP website. The address is just there. And also we're hoping to collect some best practice examples like Department of Corrective Services there, where consultations have happened with kids or systems have been tweaked accordingly. So if you go through a process like that, please do email us and let us know. We're hoping to make a compilation of such examples so people have a big range to draw on there. So just before I go, are there any other questions about this process, about what we've spoken about today? Nope. Looks like everyone is fairly comfortable with that, but if you do have any feedback or comments or questions following this webinar, please do email us at the address there. And we'll also be emailing you an evaluation form. If you could kindly complete it, that would be good. This is only the second webinar that we've ever done, so we're still learning, and any feedback that you can provide us would be great. So I'll keep this slide up for a little while, but otherwise thank you very much for attending. And is the presentation available on the website? It isn't, but we can email it to you if you think it will be useful. So perhaps you could send your email address to that info website that's up there, info@CCYP, and we'll email it out to you. But the guidelines are available on the website. So, sorry, these ones, the Are You Listening, which includes generally all the information that we spoke about and also a bit more from the consultation that's available on our website under the Complaints heading. Hey, thank you everybody for coming along, and I hope it's been useful. Bye.